Welcome back to .NET Rocks. This is Carl Franklin.
And this is Richard Campbell.
And, hey, buddy, do you remember when I installed that stupid program, that stupid app called RoboKiller?
Yes. Yeah, that was the anti-cell phone spam call software, right?
Yeah, that's right. It has a list of numbers to block for spam,
right.
And I've been getting deluged with spam on my phone, spam calls, and I have no idea why. But the other thing it does is it will play recordings and sort of waste the time of the robocallers.
Right.
Not robocallers, the spammers.
The
telemarketers, right.
The one real sin you can do to them is take up their time.
Exactly. And, most of them get it and hang up, but every once in a while, it takes one of them a little bit of time to figure it out. So go ahead and roll the crazy music for Better Know Framework, and I'll play you one of my recordings.
Awesome. All right, dude.
Let's hear it.
I've been waiting for this.
Yeah, here we go. I hope this is the right one.
Hello? Hello?
Good morning. Good morning, may I speak to Carl Franklin?
Hello?
Yes, may I speak to Mr. Carl Franklin?
Hello?
Hello, my name is Shay, and I'm a care coordinator. I'm calling from... Yes, is this Mr. Carl Franklin?
Hello?
You can feel the exasperation in her voice.
Hello?
Anyway, I think that's about it.
Okay.
It just strings her along with, hello, hello, hello. But there's a whole bunch of them. There's people having a conversation. One guy says he's out on his boat. Can you hang on a second? I'm sorry, can you say that again? And, it just goes on like that. But
Crazy.
It's crazy. How to waste a telemarketer's time.
It's true. I can't believe you get calls on your cell phone. That blows my mind.
Yep, I do.
All right.
Anyway, that's what I got. I thought I'd share that with you. It's not as funny as it could be, but at least it works.
Yeah, it seems to be doing something.
RoboKiller. All right, who's talking to us?
I grabbed a comment off of show, get this, 852.
Oh, my.
And I'll tell you why. So that's March of 2013. That's when we talked to Cord Davis about the ethics of big data. Mm-hmm. And knowing the conversation we're likely to have today, it was fascinating for me to go back through our catalog of various times we've talked about ethics and morality. And it really was this comment that jumped out at me. Because you think this is 6 years ago now, right? I mean, It's 2013. It's from Chuck Conway, who says, this show left me with more questions than answers. Because we were talking about, 2013, kind of the beginning of big data in a lot of respects.
Right.
I am not sure what to think about in big data privacy. It feels similar to the concerns of the internet in the late 90s. I recall a time when people believed that they had anonymity and by extension privacy on the internet and could say whatever they liked.
Oh, yeah.
It's still going on. It soon became clear that this was not the case, and the internet is just a big extension of the public domain. Right. We can generally figure out who you are. Don't make us.
Right.
I see immense benefit in leveraging big data. I also see that data being used in harmful ways. We are in a precarious position. Preemptive legislation to allay fears that may be unfounded and harmful. Proemptive legislation that will almost certainly be overreaching and harmful. And I find it interesting, Chuck, that no matter what happens with legislation, it's going to be harmful. I'd love to hear more about big data. Some questions I'd like to address are, what's a good use? What might constitute an inappropriate use of big data? And what's fascinating to me, of course, is seeing that question from Chuck from 2013 and thinking what's happened in the past 5 years.
Right.
And just, what have we really done with big data? We fed it to machine learning systems. That's what we've really done with it. And come up with all kinds of other interesting technology to take advantage of that data. Good or bad is a much more complex question to have there. So, Chuck, thank you so much for your comment. A copy of Music to Code By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music to Code By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or via Facebook. We publish every show there twice a week. And if you comment there and we read it on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music to Code By.
And definitely follow us on Twitter. He's at Rich Campbell. I'm at Carl Franklin. Send us a tweet. We promise not to string you along, and we can't guarantee your tweets won't fall into the hands of the evils.
Hello.
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 Oh, well. Richard, this is very exciting. we have the great Bill Buxton, who I'm just learning about, but the more I learn about him, the more I like this guy already. We haven't even talked yet. Bill is a Canadian computer scientist and designer. He's a principal researcher at Microsoft Research. He's known for being one of the pioneers in the human-computer interaction field. For over 40 years as a designer, musician, lecturer, writer, teacher, critic, and researcher, Bill has been obsessed with the evolving human technology dance. From the creative disciplines of music, his focus has evolved to the broader stage upon which this dance takes place. A practicing skeptimist. He's a devotee of Melvin Kranzberg's first law: technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It will be some combination of the two. Thus, he is driven by a pursuit of informed design, without which he believes the bias will most likely lean towards the bad rather than the good. This is going to be a great hour. Welcome, Bill.
Hello.
You sound just like that guy.
You nailed it. Oh, no.
Oh, we can start with our complaints about the design of the phone, which I have this app on, RoboKiller. Why is it that when you go to a conference, right, you get an email that has the code and the numbers and the PIN numbers to a conference call, and you can't just do that. You have to enter in the number and go back to the email, and the conference number isn't waiting for you to do that. That's a broken interaction, and that's just to get this thing started.
Yeah, no kidding.
No, I have an image I use in talks a lot where it's basically painting the line down the middle of a road, and they just paint right over a squished armadillo. And
right.
The caption is, "It's not my job."
Yeah.
And I think we have this bounded sense of responsibility, and nobody seems to have a view of the bigger picture. And that's at the micro level and also on the macro level, I think.
Indeed.
And it bites us, and it gets interrupts the flow of the activity.
It does seem like we're hitting, just recently especially, this tipping point. I mean, I did the reference from 2013 for exactly that reason. Like, we were already concerned then. We look now, especially with a lot of the new artificial intelligence technologies, and the talks that I'm doing, I'm actually saying, like, check your morality. Where are you at? How are you thinking about what your software can do?
Well, I think the there was a mention in the bio to this historian of technology, Melvin Kranzberg, and I refer to him a lot. There was a sociologist I worked with back in 1980 named Gail Moore, who introduced me to his paper, which was old at the time, and he has a set of laws, and the first one is technology is not good, it's not bad, but nor is it neutral. It will be some combination of the two. And right off the bat, that's a really interesting thing, because the first thing, if you're going to use the words good and bad, according to what moral compass? I mean, we don't think about that. We use the term good and bad, and we think we know what it means, but in reality, if you sort of said, so according to what, and according to whom,
right,
and when, and where, how deeply do we actually think about that when we're making decisions? But the other part of it is, if you're using those words, it says that virtually every single technological decision one makes, both as a creator but also as a consumer, is in fact an ethical decision.
Right.
And you're not going to get it right, because we're human beings, and so we're never going to get it right. And hence he has this second law, which is a beautiful play on the standard way of saying this, and that is that invention is the mother of necessity. And because of Kranzberg's first law, when you do create something or enter something into your life or your ecosystem, it will have some negative consequences, and therefore there's the need to fix what's broken. And if you created it, you own the mess, and you therefore have to go and clean it up without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
And so it's cyclical. You have a need, you invent something, you have some technology to address the need, and now that need may have abated, but other needs arise because of that.
So the good news is you always have a job, and the bad news is you always have a job.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that we just don't think about things in those terms. But, you know, I came up in the music industry, and my wife's a painter, and I've worked in the arts and film and so on. And I encourage, you know, people to go to their newspaper. Let's assume it's at least a decent newspaper that has reasonable criticism in the arts and so on, and read a film review, or read a theater review, or read an art review or a book review, and then contrast that with how you read a technology review. And there's a Canadian author named Margaret Atwood, and I like using her work as an example, just in the sense that if you were reviewing one of her books, the way a new laptop, for example, is being reviewed, it would be sort of like this. It's got a great cover. The illustrations are wonderful, but the binding holds the covers together, and they really, really protect the pages inside well. And they're affixed to inside. The pages are actually all holding. They fold over and they don't fall out. And there's a high luminance contrast between the color of the ink and the color of the paper that makes it really easy to distinguish the ink from the paper. There's a nice 12-point font that makes it legible. It's got a fantastic search algorithm. The words are separated by spaces and then grouped into phrases with punctuation, and then sentences, paragraphs. And by the way, there's page numbering. There's an index and a table of contents. And by the way, there's a story.
Yeah. Just a happenstance, there's a story.
And you could never do, unless you're a structural engineer, review an architect's greatest work under those criteria. But that's essentially what we do in technology. You cannot discuss any of the traditional cultural industries without taking to account the social, cultural, political, economic context and placing them that way. And what do they mean? What do they mean compared to what happened before? What do they mean to the future? And yet, and this is the part that is critical, if you ask anybody what has had more impact over the last 10 years in their life, and what do they anticipate will have the most impact over the next 10 years, and what worries them the most, I got to tell you, it's not music, it's not theater, it's not art, cinema, or dance. The digital things that we make and that are part of our life and which we consume are having more impact than all of the arts and the so-called creative disciplines put together. And yet none of us, or very few of us, statistically none of us, are thinking in those terms deeply in considering what we make and also what we consume and how we pay for it. And there's a shift there, which I think is critical, that if we don't start thinking of these things in cultural terms, and if the people making them have no training in that, much less the history of their own field, then I think we're just going to keep going down the same old path, and we probably will deserve what we get if we do that, and it won't be pretty.
I just want to unpack this metaphor a little bit about your laptop review versus a review of a book. The laptop review reader is really looking for the information that the laptop reviewer is giving them. Otherwise, there would be no reason to review a laptop. There isn't any. Is there a cultural significance or a story of a laptop beyond what it can do for, versus laptop Y, laptop X? Whereas a book is a very subjective thing that is abstract and cerebral. And a book review reader isn't going to want to know the technical details of the binding and the pages. That all that stuff is a given.
So this is why I like this kind of conversation, because I hate it when we all agree. And so I'll call you on that. The first thing is there's this thing called advertising that is the science, which and if I don't tend to believe that people line up for overnight to get the latest and greatest smartphone because they need a new smartphone or the one they have is deficient. But I believe that they allow themselves to be swayed by other forces and which are highly manipulative and on which the industry depends on. But that's not an independent decision. It very often, because they seem to believe that they're still free agents. I think that in literature, people perhaps are simply more, they might be more thinking about what they read. Let's put it this way. I think if you look at the planned obsolescence that's largely reflected in a lot of the gadgets we have today and that affect our lives, that it's hard to argue that they're all needed, and how quickly we replace them. And the problem is that if you take, your prototypical millennial, this is me, a boomer, is talking, right? I'm going to be 70 in a few months, so you can throw things at me. But I have kids and grandkids. I got a 6-year-old who's sort of into this thing. I need a new iPhone type of thing.
Right.
The issue is, these are the same people that are so concerned about the planet and what's, the excesses of consumerism and so on. And so there's these funny contrasts in terms of, the stated values and the behavior in terms of how we treat things. And I'm not pointing fingers because there's not a lot to help, think about this or discuss it, or we're far more educated in the technical aspects of our devices than we are about the cultural and social impact of them. And it's actually very interesting to me as somebody who studies the history of technology pretty intensely, and we can get into that if you like, but if you believe that the design of digital tech is one of the creative disciplines, and there is something called design there, we are the only creative discipline that does not know intimately our own history and view it in social, cultural, political terms. And we just leave things behind. We'll say, oh, that's not important. That's old. It's not history. And so for 40 years, I've actually been collecting, and actually more than 40, mostly just for reference objects for part of my own practice as a designer, the history of interactive devices. And I'm documenting them and curating them as a historian at a museum would, because they are extremely important, but it is extremely difficult, or equally difficult, to get anyone who's building narratives or stories about them that actually place them in historical terms that are as relevant to understanding the future as they are to understanding the past. And which is certainly what the case would be in art. Picasso knew the history of art. Any architect knows the history of architecture.
Sure.
The people in our field do not know the history of even 5 years ago. And the funny thing about that is we work in so-called information technologies where you would expect us to have the best tools to be informed about our own discipline. And it's only a 50-year-old discipline. We're, generally speaking, pretty ignorant of it. And it's not valued.
Just as you can hear the influence of Mozart in Beethoven's music, although it's clearly not the same.
For sure. Listen, when Keith Richards is playing a riff from Chuck Berry or whoever, Muddy Waters, he expects you, if you're a true fan, to not only recognize it, but to know where it came from.
Right.
And start asking the questions, well, why did he pick that riff instead of this other one? And why did he put it here? And where is he going to take it? And that is a huge part of the deeper appreciation of the music. I think some people can look at Johnny Ive's work, say the iPod, and say, okay, this is influenced by a Braun radio, but I'm not even sure that's the case, much less that Dieter Rams, who designed that Braun radio, he was influenced by a thing called the Regency, was it the TR1, if I remember the number correctly, which was the first widely available transistorized product. And so it goes back generation after generation to see where these threads come from. But you think about some poor sap who's coming out of design school, doesn't know the history, and wants to emulate Johnny Ive, and they're trying to do what even Johnny Ive can't do. That is to say, they're trying to think, they believe the Starkitect story. They believe the myth, the Edison myth of the person in black, and they have nothing to draw on. But if that's just drawing on the design of the device, but what about the history and how that fits in?
And Bill, I'm just going to interrupt you this one moment here for this very important message. Hi, this is Richard. The Dev Intersection Fall Show this year will be December 3rd to 6th in Las Vegas at the MGM Grand Hotel. The lineup is awesome. Scott Guthrie, Scott Hanselman, Scott Hunter, yes, all the Scotts. But also a ton of great industry speakers for some insight on what's coming up in the world of .NET. You know, Core 3 is bringing client technology like WinForms and WPF into play. Could it be time to migrate your existing desktop apps to this new technology? Come learn more at Dev Intersection, December 3rd to 6th in Las Vegas at the MGM Grand. Go to devintersection.com to register and use the code .NETROCKS to get a discount. And we're back. It's Richard Campbell, Carl Franklin. We're here on .NET Rocks, and we're talking to Bill Buxton. And you were going to give us a particular example of this not knowing our history.
Well, I think the thing that I believe is really useful to train ourselves to do is to, you could either say prospect for or plunder history from all different disciplines to inform us about the nature of our field, and on both on the positive and the negative side. I was reading a book on the history of British Navy, and just a couple of weeks ago, and the thing that really caught my eye was how the British Navy during the War of 1812 prevailed because of a very interesting partnership which involved big data. Now, they have thousands of ships out there that they have to provision and take care of where they are and man them and so on and so forth. But it was worse than that because they had to make convoys to protect all the commercial shipping. And how the heck do they keep track of all of that? Well, it turns out in the second half of the 1700s, Lloyd's of London was founded. And they're insuring all these ships. So they went and made a partnership with Lloyd's. And Lloyd's was the data processing and had the data of all the commercial shipping pretty much in the world because they were insuring them. And then they partnered with the British Navy so they could figure out how to organize and structure the convoys, which enabled them to maintain trade during all the blockades and avoid the marauding ships that are out to get them. And it's a brilliant example about as we move forward, we realize that the partnerships that got us to where we are today aren't necessarily the partnerships that are going to get us to where we're going tomorrow, and how that might have huge impacts, which in that case, it was a case where, from the British perspective, that was a wonderful use of understanding where the data lay and taking full advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hugely powerful to know those guys had that data.
Yeah. And it just happened that Lloyd's happened to be in England, right? And nobody else had insurance in that thing. The industry was at a certain tipping point where they had to scale, and they nailed it. And I love examples like that because they provoke the question: so where are we now that has a similar situation, and who aren't we talking to that's sitting hidden right in plain view in front of us if we just saw things through different eyes? And then how do we use that in ethical ways?
I'm wondering if part of this is that we're still not really a profession. You know, when I think about my eldest daughter who has a fine arts degree, part of getting her degree was an education in the origins of her of a profession and of the art, and making that connection with the past. And for the most part, in this industry, we're still doing 16 and 20-week courses to make you a web dev. And there's no room for history. We're just trying to get you through the tool set.
Yeah, I feel the same way as if I was teaching .NET now. I would really feel like an urge to go through the history of how we got here. Yet it's, I would be criticized because it's completely impractical. And I've sat through courses like that in university where, you spend a lot of time on historical stuff, and in computer science anyway, I kind of felt it didn't help me to learn what EBCDIC was, for example, except that now I have a better appreciation of where ASCII came from. But did it make me a better programmer? I don't know.
So the question is, what in history is relevant?
Yeah.
And how might it be relevant, as opposed to you have to know everything, because of course everybody's, it's hard to keep up even on something. If you want, here's the thing: the dirty little secret of highly accomplished people is what they've had to neglect in order to become highly accomplished. And because they're so highly accomplished and their brilliance is so dazzling that people around them, not through any fault, are prone to being so blinded by the brilliance in this high accomplished aspect of their skill set that they can't see that there's nothing in the shadows. And so the critical thing is that one thing is to say, of course, the problems we deal with today are really deep, take high specialization, and they don't afford the time to know all these other things. And the escape from that is being aware of the difference between expertise and literacy. And so, yes, we can go really deep, but the key thing is to reserve a certain amount. We can go shallow and broad. So I'm not a historian, but I can read about the British Navy and get these examples, and that gives me something that I can feed back into my specialty, for example.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make me a historian in that sense. And so it's a question of literacy. So I think the first thing is that preserving a certain part of our time to devote to other areas of thought and reading, in order that we have a common ground and can hold a conversation with people with other specialties. And so the way I think about this is, yes, we need really deep people. That means you can't be broad, but you can be broader in your literacy than you are in your specialty. That gives you a common ground with other people. And so it's sort of like the Renaissance is over, but long live the Renaissance. You can have a Renaissance team, and collectively we can have this broader base. And I have to point out, which I do when I talk about this, is even in the Renaissance, there wasn't Renaissance man or woman. Because if Da Vinci or Michelangelo were actually Renaissance men, why did they need the Medici? Why didn't they do their own banking?
Right.
And raise their own money? And so even there was this codependence. And I think we're at a tipping point right now, and this comes up with things like big data, AI, and so on and so forth, where we have to realize that the individual components are all critical, but none of them are essential. But because there's something new in terms of the big data, and certainly in terms of AI, we like a bunch of sheep, we go and sort of say, oh man, there's this whole new panacea, it's going to change everything, and so on and so forth. And we forget to, yeah, they're new and they're cool and they're amazing what you can do, but they're also codependent on all the other parts of the field. And so if we don't have the broader literacy to say, okay, here's this big mosaic, we've got a new piece that can add fantastic value to the collection.
Yeah.
But be clear, we should be literate about it, and figure out how it relates to us. But we shouldn't move in trying to be that, because that's the new shiny thing. And by the way, I think that people in big data and AI need to spend as much time learning about the other disciplines as they expect the other disciplines to learn about them, so that you can start to get this heterogeneous network, social network, and network of skills that work as a unit, as a holistic chunk, to deal with these hard problems.
Doesn't this also tie back to Kranzberg's fourth law, the whole idea that even though the technology is really important, non-technological issues can make that technology ultimately irrelevant? Like if you don't account for the broader environment that your technology lives in, it will run you over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think about that. I worked with Mark Weiser at Xerox PARC, and I was part of the team that brought you the notions of ubiquitous computing. The PARC tab, I did the specs for the industrial design of that, for example, and worked a lot on the live board. And Mark passed way too young. But if he were alive today, I would argue with him, and I think he would concede that I'm correct, that he used the wrong word when he talked about ubiquitous computing. And because ubiquity means everything everywhere all the time. It's always there. And that's not what Mark wrote about. And in digging through the Oxford English Dictionary to get the precise meaning of ubiquitous, I stumbled completely by accident, but not really, because those types of accidents will happen when you start digging, and found another word that's a close cousin called ubiety, U-B-I-E-T-Y, which basically means the right thing at the right place at the right time, which is different than everything everywhere all the time. And this fits into sociology, and so we're coming right back into ethics and values, because there is something, most of us know the term social mores, so it's how do you behave, and there's certain conventions about dinner parties and stuff like that. You can think about Miss Manners or whoever your guru is in terms of behavior. But the term that fits into any location would be called the moral order of place. So, for example, in your car, the moral order says that if you are using the conventional UI on your smartphone, namely fingers on and eyes on, you should lose your driver's license, no matter how good the technology is.
Yeah.
And the moral order, when you're landing in San Jose Airport, sending a critical message to your CEO, is that if you don't use eyes on and fingers on and you use voice, you should lose your job. Again, regardless of how good or bad the UI is, and the AI is, because the person beside you might be from one of your competitors, and therefore it's just violates the moral order of place. You shouldn't be talking about private things in a public space, especially in that concentrated of a location. And so these are considerations that have everything and nothing to do with the technology per se, but the location, the place, and so when I work on designs, certainly for decades, people have talked about the use of persona to figure out different usages and different people and different skills.
Yeah.
I'd argue that there's this thing which we need to introduce, which would be called playsona. So where, and I mean where in every dimension of possibility of place, where in time, where physically, proximity versus absolute position, culturally, and so on, and work through those and figure out what's the moral order in those places and how can we accommodate that. And you'll notice that one of the things that's fascinating is that, and we don't even notice it because it's so brilliantly done, is that once you've introduced your phone to your car, and notice I use the word introduced rather than paired
or connected,
because you're going to use the social term, then, and they have a kinship and a known kinship, then it automatically recognizes, hey, I'm in the car, it's your car, okay, I'm going to behave this way. And 100% of the interaction language changes. 90% of the technology locally managing the call just changes, and therefore it switches automatically to voice in and out for control as well as speaking. And and it hides without you even knowing it, Excel and Angry Birds, because it's simply inappropriate. It violates the moral order of place while you're driving your car to use them, and nobody misses them.
Yeah.
But the cool thing is when you get out of the car, 100% of the interaction language changes. 90% of the technology locally managing the call changes. And because of that, you have complete consistency of conversation. But more importantly, you have complete consistency with the moral order, because it's okay when I'm leaving the car to just go back to the touch screen and so on. And now we didn't notice that. And I'm not even going to talk about handing off the conversation from cell tower to cell tower, which is a whole other layer. But the key thing here is we don't notice how brilliantly that works. But if we did, collectively, we'd say, why the hell doesn't everything work that well?
Yeah.
And it comes right back to what you said, this nonsense about dialing the phone from you've got I mail you the phone number and trying to launch Skype, we're going to do this and that. How all this sort of stuff that comes as baggage because no one's thinking about the overall task in this larger context. And what do I have? What are the resources? What's the time pressures and so on and so forth?
I agree. Hey, hold that right there because we got a little business to do. Hey, Richard.
Yeah, buddy.
Guess what time it is now?
It must be that happy time again.
Yeah, it's time to take a hard look at the blistery mystery of artistry history.
Okay.
Did you, Bill, you probably knew this, one of the Jerry Garcia's first band's name, or maybe it was the name of the Grateful Dead before that, was Mythical Ethical Icicle Tricycle.
Yes, I'm that age.
What a great name. It's actually time to give away a $200 Amazon gift card, compliments of Progress Telerik, to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. But first, let me tell you about the most comprehensive developer toolkit for building modern apps on the market today, Telerik DevCraft. With more than 1,100 Telerik.NET and Kendo UI JavaScript components and controls, you can easily build modern, high-performant web, mobile, and desktop apps, as well as chatbots. The toolset also includes reporting solutions, automated testing, and productivity tools, and comes with a range of support options. New this year is a free online training program for all license holders, and with this, alongside thousands of demos with source code, comprehensive docs, and a full assortment of Visual Studio templates, you'll be up and running with the Progress Telerik and Kendo UI tools in no time. Download a free 30-day trial today at telerik.com/download, and also consider supporting .NET Rocks by making a monthly pledge at patreon.netrocks.com.
Well, all right, buddy. Who's our winner?
Today's winner, Richard, is Al Gaines.
Congratulations, Al.
Yep.
Golf clap for you, sir.
And Al just won a $200 shopping spree from Telerik at Amazon just for being a member of the .NET Rocks fan club. And if you'd like to be a member, go to .NETRocks.com, click on the big Get Free Stuff button, answer a few questions, and join the fan club. We have thousands of members all over the world, and every show we like to give away stuff from our sponsors. And every December we give away a $5,000 technology shopping spree. Doesn't matter where, Amazon or otherwise, to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. But you got to sign up to win. And we also like to ask our guests, Bill, if you had $5,000 to spend today on technology, what would you buy? And Richard, this ought to be really good.
Should be interesting.
I think I'd buy a canoe.
I knew you were going to say that.
I think I called that one.
But you make canoes. Why would you buy a canoe if you make them?
I make old style canoes. I normally would have said I'd buy a bicycle, but I just bought one. So
okay. And 5,000 on a bicycle is easy. 5,000 on a canoe is a trick.
I know. That's my rain bike. I can make a down payment on a bicycle. No. What I don't have is I don't have a sea kayak. And so that's why I said the canoe is our sea kayak, a tandem.
I have been investing in sea kayaks recently and picked up a used tandem that I taught my dog to ride in.
So does that mean it has two hulls and you sit between them?
No, it's one hull, but two openings.
Oh, okay. Tandem, two openings. Got it. Two-seater.
Yeah.
By the way, I have done whitewater with West Highland Terrier on the front deck, and
Nice.
with a little life jacket with a handle. So if he pops off, I was going to say poop off, but he doesn't do that, luckily, on the kayak. But you just grab the handle and lift him back up. He actually was in the bow of my windsurfer, and I'd be in the harness and cranking, and he's standing up there looking like a hood ornament.
Coincidentally, my dog is a Cairn Terrier, so cousin to the Westie. And yeah, very much same thing. He got the life jacket with the handle on the back, but I convinced him that if he's comfortable sitting in there, he should just stay put. No jumping out after seals.
Well, he probably only has to fall out once, and to get back in the boat. Just sort of, that'd probably be the last time.
Skye Terriers, the Westie, the Scotty, the Cairn, they're vermin dogs, and when they get latched on something, it doesn't matter. They'll run under a steamroller to get to a squirrel. There's a psychosis there, but it is what it is.
So here's an example, so that this isn't in fact a side conversation, but a beautiful segue into an example that fits our previous conversation around counterintuitive places that technology could play, which could illustrate that maybe thinking about things differently leads you to not only different places, but pretty interesting places that have more general application. So there's a buddy of mine here at Microsoft Research named Amos Milner, and Amos is blind. He has a dog that's one of my favorite dogs named Trevor, and I've taken Amos skiing, and for no need whatsoever, Trevor, I hold him on a leash and he skis beside me, and I sort of ski behind Amos and keep him going. But he had this crazy idea, which I thought was just insane, that he wanted to have a kayak regatta for blind people.
And for blind people.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been working on this project for mobility using non-occluding headphones, sort of so-called bone conduction headphones, and mounting an IMU on the headset so you can sense the head turning and so on and so forth, and hook that up to a phone so you get the GPS, and so that you can actually get around town, even though you've never been to that town before, relatively safely. As long as you don't try to replace your dog or your white cane, you can actually function. So part of the way that works is it uses non-speech audio rather than spoken instructions. So it's not like the turn-by-turn instructions that make you stupid when you're driving your car and they just give you short term. Rather, it uses sound beacons that you head towards that help you navigate, but it also helps build up a mental model of the space.
Cool.
So without going into that, which is pretty cool, because if you do it right, you can, unlike when you're listening to the Grateful Dead, another back reference, or the Dark Side of the Moon with your headphones on, in those cases, the sounds are spatial, but they're between the ears inside the head. But with signal processing, you can put them out in space so they integrate into the physical world, and they can be locked in space no matter how you turn your head. They stay stationary. And so this is all a really cool way to use ear cons as opposed to icons and other non-speech audio cues. And therefore, you can still hold a conversation. So Amos decided, well, heck, if we can do this on land, why don't we put virtual beacons out on Lake Sammamish around just outside of Redmond, and we'll put tandem kayaks and have a sighted person on the front just for safety, the blind person in the back with the headset, and they're the skipper and they're steering and doing things. And so they had to run a course, do this triangular course around these invisible beacons. And the cool thing is that not only did everybody do it, they never kayaked before, which was kind of funky, but when you put two sighted people in a kayak and gave them the headset, they were hopeless. The blind people beat them.
Wow.
So the key thing about this is that not only is it gives you another perspective in terms of what's a disability and so on and so forth, of what people are capable of, and also what technology can do. But it also says we've got all these late superpowers, and if you go off into the edge conditions, you come up with a solution which, in fact, has very strong implications for the general population. So, for example, now that means that if you're walking around, if you come out of King's Cross Station in London and you're trying to go to University College London, it's a lovely walk, but it's like walking through a rabbit's warren. And there's all this beautiful architecture, people driving the other side of the streets. You're about to get killed because you look the wrong way at the wrong time. And you're walking around with your phone in front of you, buried in the map, and trying to listen to things which you can't hear, and you can't be social, you can't look around you. All of that can go away. Mm. And you can just have audio cues that give you the directions. You don't look like a fake tourist, because nobody can tell that you don't know where you're going, because you're walking with confidence, because you do know where you're going, because you have the long-term view as well as the short-term, and you can hold a conversation because your cortex is free. The portion that deals with speech management as opposed to non-speech. And you'll get there. It's interesting how by pushing these edge conditions, you get insights that have far more general applicability, but more to the point. And in so doing, you end up in a way that the thing you did for your initial customer base or user base gets the benefits of the law of the larger economies of scale. And so there's a chance they might even be sustainable to be able to create these technologies, which says that in doing this stuff, thinking about the economics is as important as thinking about the technology.
Right. Before the break, you mentioned this car scenario where when you get in the car, everything should change to be voice only, input, output, everything, so that you're not looking and fiddling and touching your phone while you're driving. And I have yet to experience any phone, any device, any digital assistant that does that. Am I missing something? I mean, I ask the Google Assistant, Cortana, Siri, Alexa, all of them. You ask them a question, and I've Googled some things for you, and that's it, and you're done. You read me a Wikipedia page. What's so hard about that? Tell me the first 10 or whatever to me. Let me go through those responses.
This again comes back to when I said we were talking about the book review versus the technology review, and it had something to do with advertising and hype. And I think this comes back to the skepticist in my self-description, is that we have to be as vigilant in our skepticism as we are in our optimism. And so you have to maintain this balance. And let's be clear, this is something that I call the long nose of innovation, but things take really long time. I first used a mouse in 1971, and the mouse at that point was already 6 years old. Yeah. And the mouse I was using had been in use since 1969. It was invented in 65. It wasn't until Windows 95, 30 years later, that everybody had a mouse, because you need this larger ecosystem to come into place. Right. The short statement of that is that things are moving way, way more slowly than any of us believe, because of the false impression of a bunch of things moving slowly gives you the impression of a lot of some things moving quickly. Right. There's a lot of change, but it's not changing. Nothing's moving quickly. And it takes at least 20 years for things to really take off, because you need the whole other ecosystem, including the GUI. That was an example. I was doing capacitive multi-touch in 1984, and it wasn't until 2007 with the iPhone that it became mainstream. And right. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that what you're describing will happen. It could happen faster than it will happen, but that's simply because we are too focused in our traditional rabbit holes or silos to start to architect things for the bigger picture. So it's all about how you think about things. It comes back to you have probably interviewed a lot of people where they're talking about what's the next big thing, what's coming, what's going to happen in terms of what's the next new application, the next new service, or the next new cool device. And I'd say it's none of the above. And in fact, the next big thing is not even a thing. It's a change in the relationship amongst the things that are already there and the things that are going to come out. And when I say a change in relationship, I mean that very much in terms of the social relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And we think about social computing as being something like Facebook or Twitter, which is technology to support the social relationships amongst people. But we don't think at all about the social relationships amongst technologies themselves. So if we come into the car, I gave you a good example about how it does something pretty amazing that makes me smile every time I get out of the car, when that transition from the moral order of the car versus the moral order out of the car. But on the other hand, I have a Ford Escape, and I rented one at Whistler to go skiing. It's exactly the same car, exactly the same model. But the people who designed the technology had never considered the difference between introducing the phone to a rental car compared to your owner, the car you own.
Right.
And it should be completely different because the kinship is different, and therefore the trust relationships are different, and therefore what you're willing to share is different.
Right. No, I don't want to download all my contacts into this car. No.
Oh man, I found them. I found that. Were those your contacts I found in your car, the rental car? Because I have found in rental cars the most private personal information that the poor people who left it there had no idea that it was going into there in the first place, and it was inexcusable that it ever went in there in the first place because the people who designed the systems did not consider that, because they don't think about personas. They thought like engineers. Can I compare a phone with a car?
Yeah.
And get the data in, as opposed to whose car, when, where, and with what degree of trust. What's the social relationship? And the minute we start to use the notions of kinship and introduction, it forces, through that very language, taking a very different approach to how we deal with things.
It goes back to what you said about the philosophy of what is good and what is bad. And good for who? Good for what? Good when? Good where?
And the thing is, and this is the crazy thing, every single player that I can think of in that particular transaction would have won. Avis or Hertz would have been better. The consumer would have been better because if they knew they had a trusted relationship. Ford, General Motors, whoever the car manufacturer is, would have been better off. Everybody would have been better.
Yeah.
And it would have created trust. And the fact that there's no outrage, or just we just have gotten used to these speed bumps, and we've got complacent, and we should stop being that way. When we hit friction points, we should yell and scream.
Agree.
And also come up with a constructive solution, so we're not just a bunch of whiners.
Right.
Yeah. Always need to be offering more solutions to it. I do appreciate this idea that our moment of morality is related to ubiety. It's where you are and what you're doing, at that time, in that moment. Do you see this ascending now? Like I'm looking at the news stories around AI for the Defense Department, and a group of Google employees saying we don't want to work on this, we don't want the company to work on it, and so on. Do you see this as a surfacing of this? Is this anything new, or has it always been true?
My experience is it's always been true. I know that in the early days of SIGGRAPH, we were trying to build these animation systems and figure out rendering and this and that, and there were these. I'm going to oversimplify, but there was the military camp that would go to SIGGRAPH because they're looking for things for flight simulators and weapon systems, and there were the people who wanted to make cartoons and animation, and were the artsy fartsy people, which I was sort of more a part of, and the reality is that people would make a decision, we're going to go into this and just work on the computer animation, but of course the coolest things in the animation stuff in year N, N1 plus 1 was appearing in the flight simulators, and so there's always this crossover. Once you put something out in the world, you lose control of it, and in some sense you could say that about the internet. I'm not a specialist in networking, but it is my understanding that in the initial foundations, had it been anticipated some of the negative aspects, that some of the checks and balances could have been built into the system that would have made it much easier, shall we say, to protect. I can't speak deeply to that, but it's plausible.
We just had an event this weekend that reminded us of the origins of the internet being a group of university IT guys who just trusted each other. When Pakistan attempted to block a single YouTube video that the Pakistan government decided was offensive, and took out YouTube for 2/3 of the planet.
Yeah.
Because the BGP protocol literally has no security wrapped around it. It's just, they pushed a route and it redirected everybody through them so they could block that video. It was a mistake in what is essentially an open protocol that is the backbone of the internet.
And I think the zeitgeist at the time was, to a large part of the community, was sort of the stuff from Buckminster Fuller and McLuhan and so on about this global village, and if we could just communicate, we would start to be kind of a kumbaya moment, that with communication would come understanding and tolerance. And
they weren't wrong. I mean, I think you're seeing the evidence of all of that, but it comes with some consequences.
But it's also a double-edged sword, because we've also seen that you can use it for exactly the opposite purposes. And that, again, it comes back to Kranzberg's first law.
Well, and you mentioned McLuhan, because McLuhan's, my favorite reference to McLuhan's is, we shape our tools and then our tools shape us.
Absolutely.
That's definitely what happened to the internet. You know, we made this tool, and we're continue to make these tools, and every time we make them, they make us.
Now, that's the coolest observation. So thank you for bringing it up, because it's really timely, both in the conversation and in terms of the bigger picture. Because if we're looking for a way to fix what's broken, take the part of Kranzberg's second law, then what you just said is one of the vehicles, the tools that are, how do we design the tools and the technology so that we leverage the bias of the path of least resistance, so that it's easier to do it in the preferred way than the other way, and that channels people's behavior and expectations along a different path. I think it's perfectly fine to not be a wishy-washy liberal and say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but to try and explicitly and openly try to put biases into the tools, but carefully so, but also to be aware of the biases that are either accidentally or nefariously put into the tools.
Maybe apps need to come with a morality setting.
Could be. There's a woman from our New York lab, Kate Crawford, who I respect immensely, and she's somebody who I'd love to have this conversation with, because every time I say the word bias in tools, I picture her I look up at her virtual face in my imagination to see what her reaction's being to what I'm saying as a reality check. But the point is this: every tool already is biased. And the only question is the bias there by commission or by omission? Were they even aware that they were building a bias when they built the tool? Right. Whether it's a word processor or a web browser or any tool has an inherent bias. And that comes back to the introduction, so to speak, and sort of saying, we are building biases in the very tools we make, whether we know it or not. So we might as well make best efforts to be conscious that we're making such decisions, what they are, and what our editorial stance on that would be. So that because if we know why we made the decision and it goes wrong, having that design rationale well documented, let's just go back and do a check and maybe revise our rule set and the criteria according to which we made the decision. And it's okay to make things wrong along the way, as long as you are deliberate about it and you can take that as a learning experience, so you can do better the next time, as well as patch up the holes from the last time.
Hey, Bill, before we let you go, I want to know how your work and your outlook has helped Microsoft Research with whatever projects that you've been doing for them?
I would say that the whole notion of society of technologies, and I don't say society of devices because it includes the cloud services, applications, as well as devices. That notion of the social relationship and trying to get things to work together is one of the things which I've been working on becoming part of the culture of the company, and it is getting hold. I think that the simple way of saying it is that, if you look at these what ifs in terms of the future, what if things just work? What if things just worked together?
That's just crazy talk, Mr. Buxton. Crazy talk.
And what if in working together,
subversive,
they did so seamlessly? And what
that they
if
were transparent? It just happened.
And what if every time you added a new device or application or service, did it increase the value of everything else you had, as well as having a justifiable value on its own? And finally, and this is the kicker, what if in adding every new thing, it reduced the overall complexity?
Right. It knows its place in the big picture and provides that service.
And those are the rules of the game. They have to work together seamlessly with a reduction in overall complexity and augmentation in value. And those last two, I mean geometrically, not arithmetically. That's the aspiration.
Awesome. I can't tell you how enjoyable it was shooting the breeze with you for this last hour, Bill. And on behalf of Richard, myself, and all of our listeners, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
It's a pleasure, and thanks for making me think.
All right. Likewise. And we'll see you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Pwop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time.
Got transmitter banned by the FCC. Yes, I'm a toy boy. Life is hard.